Welcome, everybody. We are really glad that you're here. My name is Dave Rosenfeld. I'm the director of the Solar Rights Alliance. And with me today is Kaylee Underhill, the Advocacy and Development Director of the Solar Rights Alliance, and our guest speaker, Brad Hevner at CalSO, who you'll see in a moment. I just want to say again just how glad we are that you're joining us. This is the Solar-Powered Batteries webinar. And just by way of background, a couple of things, and then I'll turn it over to Kaylee to go through the agenda, and then we're just going to get right into things. So first, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Solar Rights Alliance is the nonprofit association of California solar users. We believe that everyone has the right to make energy from the sun without unreasonable interference from the utilities. We keep track of what the politicians and the regulators and the utilities are up to, and then we alert the public when there's a threat to rooftop solar or an opportunity to expand rooftop solar and batteries to more people. And that's most of what we do. In the last 2 years, we've been spending a lot of time fighting off the solar attacks. And with your help, many of you out there played a really instrumental role in defeating the utilities' effort to tax your solar. And we're going to have to keep at it, but that's not the purpose of this webinar. The thing we're going to focus on today isn't so much politics or the utilities and any of that. We're going to focus on a topic that we get questions about all the time and that we know is a hot topic, which is solar powered batteries. And so the purpose of this webinar, this is for people who don't have a battery but are interested in getting one, or maybe have a battery and have questions about it, or might want to expand your battery capacity in some way. So this is very much a consumer focused webinar. Our goal here is to give you actionable information that you can use to make good choices as a consumer. And we're recording this webinar. We're going to post it on the internet. We're going to email it out. And of course, we'll repeat this many, many times through the course of this webinar. We are always available for you to email us questions. But before we get too deeply into it, let me turn things over to Kaylee Underhill for just some housekeeping items about how this whole thing is going to work, and then we'll go from there.
So hello, everyone, and welcome again. My name is Kaylee Underhill. I am the Advocacy and Development Director with Solar Rights Alliance. I'm very excited to be here with all of you and Dave and Brad this evening. Just a few quick housekeeping items. Number one, we have turned off the chat so that everyone can focus on the content of this webinar, but we have enabled the Q&A feature, and I will be monitoring that. So as the webinar is continuing forward, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And when we get to the audience Q&A section, I will pull some of those for Brad to give us some more information in response to. If your question isn't answered during the course of this webinar, please do reach out to us at info@solarrights.org, and we're happy to help where and when we can. And then secondly, quick note on that. We don't make product recommendations, so we can't get you that far, but we can give you tips and resources and information so that you can make the right decision for you. So we're happy to help with all of those types of questions. And now I'm going to hand it back to Dave to introduce our guest speaker.
Okay, great. And Kaylee, I just sent you a note that see if we can do something to maybe help with Brad's video screen. So just see it. I just texted you. Okay, so let me introduce our guest speaker, Brad Hevner. He'll talk a little bit about himself. I just want to say a few words just by way of why did we ask Brad to join us. So there we go. Excellent. I've known Brad, I think, for at least 20 years. You know, and this is, and the time that I've worked with Brad precedes the time that I've worked in the solar world. And I believe that would be the case for Brad when I was just a young, you know, essentially an activist and a community organizer on a variety of issues working around the country, including in California. And I ran into Brad numerous occasions, and already he's a few years older than me, was wiser, and was already doing really, really impressive research and policy work and advocacy work, and was always just the guy if you needed an answer to a question and needed that answer to be absolutely 100% correct. There was just very few people to go to, and Brad was always one of them. I lost touch with Brad, and then when I came in 2018 to really help kind of start Solar Rights Alliance, it was to my surprise and just absolute delight that I learned that Brad was the policy director over at the California Solar and Storage Association, an organization that we work with very, very closely. And that has served Solar Rights Alliance very well. I turn to Brad often for questions and just detailed things where we need to give really good information to you. So when we were getting a lot of requests to do an intentional seminar, webinar, whatever you want to call it, on battery storage, there was just clearly for me one person that we needed to get on to help educate you, and that was Brad. So we're going to do this as an interview style thing. We've got a bunch of questions that are from you, the audience, and then Brad's going to answer them. We'll see how far we can get. But let me just first turn it over to Brad. And Brad, if you could just maybe introduce yourself a bit more than what I've just said, and then we'll just dive right into the questions.
Okay, sure. Hi, Dave and Kaylee. Thanks for having me on here. And yes, Dave, you've been a valued partner of mine for many years. We did some good work together a long time ago. And like you, I've done a lot of advocacy for different causes before coming to solar. I've now been in solar full-time for 10 years. So I've been in this particular job here coming up on 10 years, policy director of the California State Association of Solar and Storage Companies. And so it's been good. You know, I've loved focusing entirely on solar and storage these past 10 years and helping to build the industry. And we're very impressed with all you've done with the Solar Rights Alliance. It's really crucial, the work that you do. So really, very happy to participate here.
Yeah. Well, the feeling is mutual. And with that, let's just get into it. So again, just to remind people, we've got a list of questions here. We're not going to stick so much to a script. Brad might say something. I might then follow up with some follow-up questions. We're going to try to get through as many questions as we can. We're not going to get to every single thing that's on your mind. You can always email us. I'll just say again at info@solarrights.org. Kaylee and I, our whole mantra is zero inbox. Like we actually do want to respond to every single thing. We try to do it quickly. We can't always do it quickly, but we will always try to do it. And so, you know, the goal is no question left unanswered, whether we get to it here or we get to it afterwards. So Brad, let's just start right from the beginning. I think the biggest question that a lot of people have is just, why should I get a battery? Like, what would a battery do for me? I'm wondering if you can just start there.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's two big functions of the battery for consumers, and it's to provide backup power when the grid is down, and also to reduce your utility bill. And those are two separate things that a battery can do, and one battery can do both. And you know, so a lot of people get batteries because they're in a place that has a lot of power shutoffs, and that they're sensitive to that. And it's worth it just to pay for a battery and know that your power is never going to go out. It's interesting to talk to people who have backup batteries, and they all tell the story where there was a power outage in the neighborhood and they didn't even know. Their neighbor said, "Hey, what about that power outage?" And they said, "What power outage?" And so, you know, it's nice for people to be able to carry through, you know, simple things like your refrigerated food doesn't spoil, but then if you've got electronics or anything, you know, anything that really matters to you, you're able to power through. And then you can also use a battery, it's similar to solar, to reduce your utility bill. It's a good investment for many customers. And it's a little bit different for existing solar customers that are on NEM1 or NEM2 versus new customers that are going to be on NEM3. And for NEM3, a battery will be very crucial to savings at all. It works together with the solar. Together with the solar, they create savings. It'll be more difficult for solar alone to create savings without a battery in NEM3, although possible for some customers. But so it's really a key component for the bill reduction in NEM3. For NEM1 and NEM2, you can pay off the battery over the life. You know, the amount of savings you get on your bill will pay for your battery, but kind of barely, right? You're doing okay financially with solar only on NEM1 or NEM2, chances are. So you can get that battery, and you know you're probably going to break even on it over time, and then you'll have the added benefit of backup power. So those are the two benefits. I can go into some of the, you know, I created some slides with some rate structures to kind of visualize that. I don't know if now is the right time. We want to jump right in. I don't want to spend a lot of time on like graphs and technical, but it might be helpful to look at some of the cost curves.
Yeah, what do you think? We can do it now. We can also punt it later. I defer to your judgment.
Let's
This might be a
go
good
ahead and jump in and look at that, and then we'll be done with it.
And just before you do, just a terminology for people. NEM1, NEM2, NEM3, you might hear these things. NEM1 and NEM2 refer to anyone that has gotten solar more or less before April 15th of this year. And that essentially represents is the extra energy that you share back to the grid. You're getting like a decent rate for it. You're getting more or less like the retail rate for electricity. After April 15th, anyone that's going solar, you're getting a much diminished rate for that extra energy you give back to the grid, which is why then a battery has a lot more value, under NEM, or really is critical for making solar work under NEM3. But as Brad said, if you're on NEM1 or NEM2, it still has a lot of value.
That's right. Yep. So if we look at Southern California Edison rates, for example, on a summer weekday, these are time of use rates, TOU. And if you're on NEM1, you can be on any rate structure. You might be on non-TOU rates, or you might be on TOU, time of use rates. It's up to you. For NEM2, you have to be on time of use rates. And it's most likely you're going to be on these orange ones, the TOU D49. And the first 300 or so kilowatt hours per year, per month are going to be at one price. And then after a certain point in the month, you jump to a higher price. So it's called the baseline and above baseline. But these are basically your rates all day up through 4 p.m. And then from 4 to 9, you're at higher rates, and it goes back down 9 to midnight. If you're on NEM3, you have to be on one specific rate plan, and it's this blue line. So it's cheaper in the off peak, but more expensive in the peak. And you can see 24 cents in the daytime, 62 cents in the evening. And your solar is generating mostly in the middle of the day, right? You have limited solar generation after 4 p.m. So if you're not using all the power you produce, you're exporting it to the grid at these prices. This is your credit value under NEM2 roughly. Or if you're offsetting the amount of power that you use, this is electricity you're not buying at this price. But if you have a battery, you can avoid buying electricity at this price. And this is when most residential customers use most of their power. It's really surprising how much of people's power is evening usage. And that's at the higher prices. So if you have a battery, you can store that solar power and not buy power from the utility when power is expensive. That's really the value. And so you can, this is weekends for Edison, and the winter, it's also pretty sharp. Let me just flip through these quickly to give you a little taste. PG&E is much milder between the differences between peak and off peak, but there's still, your 33 cents to 55 cents, 56 cents. And that's a pretty high price if you're able to avoid buying that power. We're buying right now a lot of power for 56 cents a kilowatt hour. It's expensive. It's crazy expensive. So with the battery and solar, you can not buy the utility power at those prices, and that pays off over time. The winter is very mild there. And in San Diego, SDG&E, you've got similar, and this is above 80 cents a kilowatt hour. It's just an insanely high electric rate for the peak summer in California, especially San Diego. And so you're going to save money if you have solar and storage and you stop buying power for 83 cents a kilowatt hour for your evening usage. But you kind of need a battery to do that, right? The solar is only going to get at a little bit of that. So also in winter, you have some peak to off peak. So that's really, the curves, as you can see, are all similar. It's the 4 to 9 peak hour when electricity is expensive that really matters for your bill. And with solar, it's okay to export here and buy here. That's not bad at all. But if you can stop buying here, it's even better. But then you have the cost of the battery on top of the solar that gets you that extra benefit. So you just have to, work with a contractor to run through the numbers and see what the payback period is. One final thing here, and this is, I know a lot of numbers, but under NEM3, instead of having roughly the same rate for exporting power to the grid as buying power, you have different rates when you're not using electricity and putting it on the grid. A lot of them are 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And these are prime solar generating hours, 7-8 cents a kilowatt hour. So you're getting a lot less for the electricity you give to the utilities under NEM3, except in certain hours. September to 6 to 8 p.m., you're a power plant that's getting a high price for power you give to the utility, a crazy high price. So with a battery, you can export to the grid during these hours and make some pretty good money, good bill credits that will more quickly pay off your system. So it's going to matter in the overall financials of NEM3, if you have solar plus storage, you're able to export when the grid and the utility need it the most, and they'll pay you handsomely for it. But you're absolutely going to need a battery to capitalize on those opportunities. So hopefully that was helpful. Just a quick peek.
Yeah, no, I think that is very helpful for people to see it. And I want to just pick up on one thing that you said, and then we'll move to the next question is, we're not here to sell anyone a battery per se. So what you were saying was obviously is when you're reaching out to installers and these are the kinds of questions you should ask and see what would be the return on investment for you, obviously. But what Brad is showing everyone here is this is the potential kinds of savings that you could see and the reason why you could end up saving money over the long run by doing this kind of thing. This is a follow-up question to just like, why would you get a battery? Obviously, you've gone through, you can avoid blackouts and you can also save money on your electricity bill. How long can a battery power a home during an outage? If you're in an outage situation, what can an average homeowner expect? And, can it power the whole home? Is it part of the home? Like what are the expectations that we could set for people?
Well, they are all options. You have a wide variety of options. Typically, people have just backed up their critical circuits. It might be the refrigerator, the lights, the power in your office, and a few plugs, and probably not the air conditioner, and not all the plugs, not all the lights, and not the pool pump, and so you choose what's the critical loads is what we call them, and you put them on a different panel, and you connect the battery to that panel. So during an outage, you're just powering the critical loads. And then there's whole home backup. There's more and more talk about trying to design for whole home backup where you don't have to worry about it. When there's an outage, you're probably going to want to conserve energy. You don't turn everything on because the power's out and you want to conserve, but you're able to leave the air conditioner on or anything throughout the house. So you have those two options. Obviously, you need a bigger battery for a whole home backup than if you're just powering critical loads. And then as to how long it can go on, I mean, theoretically, indefinitely. If your critical load usage is small and you have a large battery, and you recharge it when the sun comes up every day, you can go on for days without being without power. But oftentimes people will get 2 or 4 or 5 or 6 hours worth of storage out of their battery. And for a lot of outages that aren't multi-day, a typical outage lasts a lot less than 4 hours. And so you can get all the way through that with a smaller battery. That is more typical where you're just sizing it to get through some period of hours.
Good. So this is another set of questions for people in the audience here. These are the kinds of questions you ought to be asking an installer, obviously, and try to figure out what is the right kind of package essentially for the price that you're willing to pay. And that's good segue into the next question, which is just how much do batteries cost?
Yeah, it's a range, obviously, depending on the size, but I think a number that I often hear that the contractors will throw out is you should expect to pay $16,000 for the entire energy storage system. And then there's a 30% tax credit, so you're only paying 70% of that. So a $16,000 storage system becomes $11,000 in real cost. They can be more than that for a much bigger battery. They can be cheaper for that if you just have a simple connection and there's not any complications. It can be much less than that. A general rule of thumb that I have in looking at the data and what most people are paying is $1,100 a kilowatt hour. So if you have a 10 kilowatt hour battery, that might cost $11,000 all told, and before the tax credit. Typically a lot of residential batteries are 14 kilowatt hours or so. And so that gets you up to the $15,000 range. So that's where, and they've been pretty consistently $1,100 a kilowatt hour for several years now. And show, we're all hoping to come down, but we don't expect them to move off of that right away.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question was, are the prices going to go down? It sounds like you're saying, hopefully they do. That's generally the arc of these kinds of technologies, but it's just hard to say.
Yeah, there's no doubt they will one day, but most of what I hear is it's going to be 3 years without any cost reduction, because electric vehicles are in need of a lot of batteries, and there's only so much battery manufacturing capacity throughout the world. So companies are very busily building battery factories all over the world, but it's barely enough to keep, it's not even enough to keep up with EV demand. And then EVs kind of have the first dibs on the battery cells, just
Right.
the way the market works. And then the home batteries are after that. So the supplies are tight, and that's going to continue for at least 3 years, is what I hear, and that really looks right to me. So you can wait 4 or 5 years to get a battery, but then that's 5 years worth of not having a battery. It's a pretty long time. And in the meantime, you know, it might be worth just jumping in at today's prices so that you can have that benefit.
Right. That's very helpful. And you mentioned the federal tax credit. So that's if you pay taxes. If you don't pay taxes, doesn't work for you. But assuming you pay taxes, it's 30% of the cost of the battery, assuming I have that right.
Yes.
And I believe that can also cover the cost of panel upgrades if you need to have it in relation to the battery. Is that correct?
Yeah, for all the solar and the storage together, all the costs, the equipment, the installation, the permit, all the associated stuff, you get 30% off of the total price of the solar and the storage.
So that's the federal incentive that exists. Are there any other incentives that are out there for getting a battery?
Well, there's been a state program for a bunch of years, the Self-Generation Incentive Program, SGIP, and it has funded customer rebates for a lot of systems. You apply to the program, and after they process everything, you get a check in the mail from the utility processes it, but it's state money, and but that money is out for most types of customers. There is some money left for residential low income customers, but you have to have a deed restriction on your house. So it's really for low income properties that are deed restricted. And that hasn't been moving very much. There is a new pot of money that was just approved by the state legislature to rejuvenate that, and we're hoping to get rid of that deed restriction rule. So for low income customers, there will be the battery rebate budget will be back up. I think it's $630 million over 3 years. So a pretty good chunk of change. A lot of customers will be able to take advantage of that if you are low income. And the definition of low income has not yet been set. So traditionally with some of these programs, it's been if you qualify for the CARE reduced utility rates in California, you qualify for this program. But that's a pretty low amount of income. It's 200% of the federal poverty level, which is a very poor family. We're hoping that they up that to have a higher bar to cover low and moderate income households. But we won't know that for a couple of months how that shakes out. One way or another, that's the only program in terms of state incentive that we expect to be established as straight incentives. So we can talk about some of the virtual power plant stuff later. There's other places where you can get revenue and rebates, but it's not really a rebate. That's the one rebate program is pretty much now just for low income customers.
Got it. Okay. So for everybody, there's a federal tax credit, 30%. There is a state rebate that is not really available right now for all except the most low income customers. They might reestablish it, and it might be available for both more low income customers and people in the general market, but that is to be determined at the moment.
Yeah, it's going to be low. I mean, we're pushing for 80% of the average county income, basically area median income. So if you're under 80% of area of the income in your area, you might qualify as low income. Moderate income, I define as being higher than that. So it's still, it's going to be targeted at low income.
Right. Okay. All right. So let's move then to just battery products. I think the question a lot of people have is are there any differences between the different battery products that are out there on the market, and how can people learn more about the different battery options? A lot of people have heard of a Tesla Powerwall, but there are other companies as well. And what can you tell people about what they ought to know and how they can learn more?
Yeah, there are a bunch of products out there, and the best way is to talk to a few contractors. It's the same as solar. Get 3 bids. Find 3 contractors, either referrals from your friends or online if you don't have any referrals, and get 3 bids. And each contractor tends to have 1 or 2 or 3 battery companies that they work with, because every storage product is a little bit different in terms of the installation and how you connect it and turn it on. And you want your installation crew to be very well trained to make sure they do it exactly by manufacturer's specifications. Contractors go through a lot of training from the manufacturers to make sure they're installing the products exactly right. And you can't train, you don't want your installation crew to be trained on every product, because that's just, you don't need that. So most contractors have 2 or 3 favorite battery products that their crews are trained on. And when you talk to a few contractors, they'll tell you, I like this kind of battery. This is what I've been installing. I think it's a good product. Here's why. You talk to another contractor, they say they might prefer a different battery, and they'll explain why. And you just take in what they say and make the decision. In reality, they're all similar. There's some differences in sizing and power output. They're pretty much all lithium-based storage now. So every battery needs to have, some metal that it uses as a storage medium. And lead acid batteries is what we used to use for many years. And now lithium has really taken over, and all the main products that are out there. There are other technologies, zinc and sodium and lead. There's others that are kind of experimental and may come in the future, but are unproven and have been very slow to come to market. So lithium is the way, and I expect it to continue to be the way for a good long time. It's pretty well proven at this point that it works and it's here to stay. So the reality is, there's differences in if you want whole home backup versus critical loads backup, or maybe you're not interested in backup, you just want to reduce your bill. Different products are a little geared towards different use cases like that. But even then, they're pretty similar. So I've got a list here. Let me show the last slide in my little deck here. There's a list of the companies, the manufacturers that have residential products on the market right now. So it's a pretty good number of companies, right? And Tesla, Powerwall, you mentioned, and for a long time that was by far the majority of the market. These others, some of them are kind of Tesla, Powerwall lookalikes. Some of them are a little bit different in various ways, but these are all out there with proven products that customers have been installing. And again, talk to a contractor and they'll tell you what the advantages are.
Great. Okay, well, so you mentioned, let's say you've decided you're interested, you want to go through the process. I think you mentioned what we consider to be the cardinal rule already, which is get 3 bids. Yeah. Do whatever it takes, but go back to the company that installed your solar panels to begin with. If you already have solar, walk around the neighborhood, go on Yelp, look at reviews, all that kind of stuff. We also will always tell people, and by the way, everyone, we're going to put this in when we send out a wrap up and we send out the recording, we will include some of this information in writing. We always tell people, make sure they're a member of CALSA, because that will increase the likelihood that the company adheres to a code of ethics that does right by the customer. The other thing we tell people is you should probably give preference to someone that's certified by an organization called NABCEP, which again, we'll put in writing if you can't catch that acronym. Are there any other tips that you would give consumers who are shopping around, and just in terms of like vetting, different installers and trying to figure out which one's right for you?
Well, number one, before either of those, is to make sure they have a valid contractor's license, because there are some out there that don't, and you should not do business with them. I don't think it's very common that you'll run into an unlicensed contractor, but it happens. So you need to make sure. Contractors are licensed by the state. They have to have be in good standing, and you can go to the state contractors licensing board and look up the license number. You can look it up by the contractor's name too, and it'll show if there are any pending complaints or reviews of the contractor. So that's number one, to make sure they're licensed. Number two, I agree. See if they're a member of the state association, that shows they're paying attention to the rules. They're keeping up to date on all the policies and the utility rules. And then NABCEP, I agree. That's the same thing. Those are the ones.
Okay. I think I'll add another one, which is, I think this goes in the general category of any kind of like large expense, especially if you're doing like home improvement, is like when you talk to the installers and you ask them all your questions, which is the one that like just kind of makes sense to you? They're not talking down to you. you kind of understand what they're saying, they're answering your questions. I mean, does that seem right also? Like there's a gut instinct that even a relatively uneducated person can determine.
That's absolutely right. I've done this a lot of times, helping friends of mine install solar or choose a solar contract. And, I might give tips on which contractors to reach out to, and they get a bunch of bids and they come to me and they say, well, I like this and I like about this person, I like this about this person. They all seem kind of similar, and I'm not sure, this one's a little more expensive, but it seems a little better. I'm not sure if it's worth it. And almost every time when I look at it and I hear those details, and I think you can't go wrong. They're either of these, those 2 or 3 options, they're all good options. Who do you like? Who did you click with? Who do you want to work with in your house? Who do you click with? And I think that's really an important thing.
Good. So let's say you've gone, you're now down the road of looking. Like, how long does it take from the point that you pull the trigger on a contractor, you sign a contract, to actually having the battery being operational? Is there like a standard window of time that this works?
It's a wide range, from 2 months to 9 months would be a range. Theoretically, it should be a month or 2, but then a lot of installers keep a installation queue of 2 to 3 months. That's standard because they just want to keep their people busy all the time. So if you have a little backload of work, you're making sure everyone's really productive every day. And so even in normal times, a 2 to 3 month lag is normal. We're currently experiencing a big surge in the market because of the end of NEM2. When the NEM2 application deadline came, there was a big surge of applications. So a lot of contractors have more like a 5-6 month backlog of work. And so, it might be worth waiting. If you find somebody you like, you can wait 6 months. That's okay. You should expect it's a little bit longer right now. So that's on just the installation side, what contractors can do. And then there's permitting and utility approval. And those can take time. Generally, permitting shouldn't be too time consuming. It can be a pain in the neck for the installer, but it shouldn't take more than a couple of weeks, and sometimes can take 1 day. Getting the utility approval is the one that can be tricky. If you install anything, solar or storage, generator, anything, you need to submit an application to the utility, and they'll make sure the local transformer is good enough and other things are okay, and they give you the green light. And you have to wait for them to do that before you turn it on. So that can cause a delay. And then sometimes the permit, I should go back to the permit, because getting the approval to install, the initial permit, is usually pretty easy. You just say, here's what I'm going to install, here's the address, basic, the contractors know how to fill out that application, you get to go ahead. Then the inspector comes out afterwards and inspects to make sure it was done according to code. And they can find things that are nitpicky, where the contractor feels like they did everything right, but this inspector doesn't like the way this one thing was hung on the wall or something, or they want this, the tube that carries the wire to be coming in a different direction. And yet they can tell you to nitpick, add a sprinkler, whether you need a sprinkler in a garage is kind of a controversial thing right now, or a heat alarm. And whether if you're installing in the back of the garage and you're parking in the garage, do you need a barrier to make sure your car doesn't smash into the wall that the battery's hung on? And there different cities and counties will interpret those rules differently. So sometimes the contractor installs things all perfectly, and the inspector comes out and says, yeah, actually you need to install a barrier in a garage, and then the contractor has to fit you back in their schedule, come out, do that work, and that can cause delay.
That seems like another reason why also, when you're looking for an installer, look for someone, ask them how many battery installs have they done in the area, because they'll have a little bit more experience with this and be less likely to get dinged by the inspector, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's true. That's very true. But I'll tell you, those local inspectors can have good days and bad days, and sometimes you can't control what they do.
Yeah, I've had that experience myself. Are there any other, while we're on the topic, are there any other kind of like pitfalls, or just sort of like, unexpected things that can come up when you are seeking a battery? Like, I think one installer has told me, once we start doing the wiring, if your home wiring is a little weird and it was hard to anticipate, that might cause some delays also. But is that true? Are there any other things that are like that consumers just ought to be prepared for, it's not a reason not to do it, but it's just setting expectations about how long it'll take.
That's true. Things can come up. They go into the electric panel and it's not what they expected, and they have to rewire something, and it becomes a bigger job. We all in our home improvement. You start doing something, it ends up being a bigger job than you expected, and that that even happens with an experienced contractor. So those things happen. I mean, product availability can happen where you sign a contract for a battery. They're available at that time, but 2 months later, when the contractor is about to do the installation, that battery product isn't shipping. The manufacturer is sold out for a while, and you have to wait a couple of months, 3 months. Those kinds of delays can happen. It's aggravating, but it's not the end of the world. Right. Another one though is the service panel, your main electric panel. Your contractor should have a pretty good idea when they first visit the home whether or not you need a bigger electric panel. Oftentimes when you install solar and storage, and especially with an EV, you might need to upgrade to a larger electric panel. And that can be a hassle and a cost because the rules on code has changed over the years. So if you have a really old panel and it's right next to the gas meter that might leak, and there'd be a spark at the electric panel, the utilities are fussy about having them next to each other. So there's some older configurations, and when you go to do the electric panel upgrade, it can be a bigger job than you bargained for. So be aware of that issue, but again, the contractor should have a very good idea of what that's going to be like when they first look at the house.
Right. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like two parts of your brain. Like one is just the decision to do it. Like there's the reasons to do it, to avoid blackouts, to save money on your electricity bill and avoid the really expensive evening electricity rates that you were showing us. Then obviously there's finding the contractor that feels really good and checks all these boxes. And then there's just a little bit of, you just got to be patient sometimes. Sometimes it's really quick. Sometimes it might be a little longer. And that's kind of like the three phases of the consumer process. You mentioned electric cars, and this is a really common question. And I have to confess, I'm curious about this myself as a consumer, is can I use, I think a lot of people are wondering, when can I start to use my electric car as a battery? Is that even a good idea? Is that going to work? Is that going to be an option? Should they do it? Can you talk a little bit about that whole ball of wax?
Sure. I think connecting your battery, powering your house with your car is going to become common someday. It's not now. We're not ready. The rules are complicated. There are some that are starting to do that. The Ford Lightning F-150 electric has got a big battery in it, and there's some companies that are all geared up to do that. But I don't believe that they're currently being installed to do the two-way power flow from that battery yet. It's going to be capable of doing so, and very soon we might be operational. But we're having a challenge with some of the utility rules about plugging your car into the grid, essentially. And so I think I'm very confident it's going to happen because there's a lot of storage in that car. A typical car has 75 kilowatt hours of storage. The battery on the wall has 14. Right. So that car, if you're just driving around town, you're not commuting a long distance every day, you've got a lot of energy that you can use there. And even if you're nervous about the life of the car, or the availability, or range anxiety and all that, there's a lot of wiggle room if you're not really commuting long distances every day. And I think people are going to reach the comfort level where they're okay using the stored energy in the car for non-car purposes. But again, it isn't ready yet.
In terms of it isn't ready yet, is there a difference on the readiness for using your car as a backup to your house? I think what's commonly called vehicle to home, versus using your car as sort of directly plugged into the grid, vehicle to grid. Is there any difference on readiness there?
Well, they're both not ready. And so I'm not up to date on where those rules stand. But it's my impression that in either of those cases, we're not quite ready. It'll be a couple of years.
Got it. It's more about policy rules, less about having the right doohickey to plug into the house and that kind of thing.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Okay. A couple more questions that we pre-planned, and then let's move to audience questions. We'll bump to Kaylee. Here's a real basic one. If I'm on NEM1 or NEM2 and I get a battery, am I going to lose my net metering status?
No. That's a very important rule. And if you are on NEM1 and M2 and you add solar panels, except in some, I mean, there are ways to do that, but if you don't have special controls, I don't know, we're going to go into those details. Typically, if you just double the size of your solar system, you are going to lose your NEM status, right? You get kicked down to NEM3. But if you're only adding a battery, there's an exemption to that losing a NEM status, because the state regulators don't want to discourage batteries. They want everyone with a solar system to get a battery. So they went out of their way to say, we're going to keep your net metering the same if all you're doing is adding a battery.
Okay. All right. One very plain vanilla question, and the one that's a little bit more policy oriented. What's the average battery warranty? And can you tell anything about the warranties on the battery products?
10 years has been very standard for as long as these products have been on the market. Some companies are now offering 12 and 15-year warranties. So that's basically, I mean, in my mind, you can expect it to last 15 years, but it's probably only warranted still for 10. It's gonna lose some of its oomph over time. It loses some of its charge capacity. Just a couple % a year. I don't know what the actual number is, but it diminishes a little bit over time. But it's going to be mostly as strong as it was in year 1 when you get to year 10, and after that, I think it goes downhill.
Okay.
So if you've got a 30-year solar system, you should just expect to replace the battery once. Ideally just once. 25 to 30 years on the solar, 12 years in the battery.
Right. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about virtual power plants? I think we're getting more and more, I think we're seeing inquiries from Solar Rights Alliance people who are getting offers from either their solar company or the utility themselves to join some kind of virtual power plant. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about what they are? And, if people are getting pitched to join one, how should they evaluate whether it's a good deal or not?
Yeah, well, it's becoming more common. We expect it to become much more common, but it's in response to the power shortages that we've had, and especially the blackout that happened in August 2020, right? We lost power statewide in August 2020. We had a blackout, and it was a big deal. It was a hit on the economy. It was inconvenience, but it was a real economic blow. It's surprising when you think about everything that gets disrupted in the economic value of that. It's big numbers. So there's a lot of interest in doing whatever it takes to avoid any blackouts. And we've been on the margin in some summer hot days, right? Where typically we import a lot of power from Arizona and other states on the days when we're really cranking our air conditioning. And if those other states suddenly don't have power available, it's a panic in the California grid operator's office. And they're willing to pay a high price for anyone who can provide power. We're always saying, hey, look at us, we've got power, we'd love to sell you power at a fair price. It's horrible when we have power stored in our garage and they are desperate for power and we can't give it to them. We want to have a fair market to do that. So programs have been launched to do that. I think they should be much more widespread, and they will become much more widespread. But to the extent they're available now, the state's actually paying a pretty high price for that power. They were toying with this idea for a long time. They said, yeah, I know I should do it, but it's complicated. And how do we know it's actually extra power for the grid and all this stuff? And then we had the blackout and they say, okay, fine, we'll pay you what it takes. And so they've got a generous price that they've been putting out for the past couple of years, which is scheduled to continue for at least a couple more years. So the offerings that people are seeing now, I don't know, I'm sure there's a lot of obscure things I'm not aware of, but the main ones that are out there are a pretty good deal. You do need to, make it, in some of them, you need to guarantee that you'll have power available, right? And that means not using it for your own backup. But if it's a high enough value, you might want that. Other programs are actually voluntary, that if you don't end up showing up, there's no penalty. And if you do show up and discharge some power when you're called on, you get paid. So it's kind of a no regrets.
Well, that's what I've seen. And just to back up for those who maybe aren't following what we're talking about, that, a virtual power plant is, this only works if you have a battery, but oftentimes a solar company or the utility will go to you and say, hey, we see you have a battery. Let's make a deal. In exchange for you allowing us to draw some juice from your battery on these hot summer days or what have you, where we have a flex alert or a blackout threat, we'll give you some kind of compensation that should be worth your while. And so what we're trying to just kind of get at is just what might be the reasons to do it. Is there any kind of like other, I think you mentioned they might pay you a pretty penny, but I think if I was a consumer, I'd be thinking, how do I figure out if the penny they're paying is, worth it to me versus just keeping it? And is there a price point that would be, because
Well, it's
obviously
above
you
the
mentioned,
rate, right? What you would otherwise be doing with your electricity is powering your own home, not buying power from the utility. So that's 60 or 80 cents a kilowatt hour. If they pay you $2 a kilowatt hour, you're making money, right? And $2 is the flat fee that has been in place for the main program.
even if they're paying you $1 a kilowatt hour, that would be higher than 80 cents a kilowatt hour.
Exactly, that's it. So, and we're talking about roughly 20 hours per year. We made a deal, and the last time this program was revamped, and we needed a minimum because it's it takes some brain damage for us to set up these programs, control the fleet of batteries, and to have the customer agreements, and we don't want to go through all that if they might not have a desperate situation where they pay you. So they agreed to say, okay, we'll pay this price a minimum of 20 hours per year. So you do the math there, 20 hours times $2 a kilowatt hour, and however much energy that you have stored. It's typical. It's not a huge, you get a check at the end of the year for $140. $140 isn't going to, pay off your mortgage, but it's, it's half the 1 month's bill, or whatever that is. It adds up over 10 years, and there's no reason not to do it.
Right. Okay. All right. So I think those are the pre-planned questions we had that were sort of like the most common questions that we've gotten over the last year. And then Kaylee has been monitoring the Q&A. And I think we have about 15 more minutes to try to just blaze through as many of these as we can. And again, I'll just reiterate, we're not going to get through every single question. If we didn't answer a question that you have, shoot us an email at info@solarrights.org. We are going to send a recording of this out to everyone who registered. We'll include some links to the information that we've been covering here today. So don't panic if we don't get to it, but let's use the next 15 minutes or so, a little less than that, to just see what people are asking. So Kaylee, take it away.
Sounds great. And a huge thank you to the folks who have been putting questions in that Q&A box. Just for context, there are over 400 questions that have come in, which is great. But it does mean, to reiterate what Dave said, we won't be able to get to all of them, but I've been noticing that they fall under themes. So let's see if we can address sets of questions, and hopefully most folks will get their question or a version of it answered. So first one, Brad, is a lot of folks have said that they're hearing that the cost of batteries is going to go down. How does that happen? How does the cost of batteries go down? And what's the timeline for that cost reduction?
Well, it's really just supply and demand, right? And we're struggling to keep up with all the growing demand, and so the price is high. And there's also, it's new, so the efficiencies aren't there. The manufacturers will get better over time. The installers will get more efficient over time. The local building inspectors will get more standardized over time. All those things add cost when anyone is inefficient. But again, I think that it'll be 3 years before we see any price reduction. I could be wrong. Everyone asks, and everyone sort of has an opinion, but that's where it congregates. And I think that's worth counting on. Is we'll be stuck at the current prices for that amount of time.
Thank you. And so, leading right into the next question, a lot of folks are wondering, okay, the technology is changing quickly. So how can we make sure we aren't getting something that will then soon be obsolete?
Yeah, it's changing, but it isn't. I expect that the products will evolve a little bit, but we're pretty well settled into lithium as the main medium. And the size, is what it is. They're all, in a similar range. Some of the functionality in terms of how it can be controlled as part of a fleet, that's the communications with the aggregator of batteries, that kind of stuff evolves over time. But I think I don't expect any wholesale changes that are going to say, oh, my 2-year-old battery isn't what it could be if I bought one today. I don't really see that.
Gotcha. And so people are also wondering, is it possible to add a battery to an existing solar system without purchasing additional solar panels? And as a connected question, do the kind of panels you have define what kind of battery you can then get installed?
Yeah, so first off, it's beneficial to add only a battery and not add more panels, because then you'll keep your net metering status from your existing system. It's presuming you're an NEM1 or an M2 customer, not one that installed just very recently, or that applied very recently. And so that's going to be the most common thing, I think, is that people add only a battery to an existing system without adding panels. There are some ways that we're figuring out to add panels without losing net metering, but it's a little unproven yet. In terms of what panels you have, it doesn't matter. It's just the total power output is the only thing that matter. But the output from the solar panels is all the same.
Great. Okay. So any kind of panel should be able to work with any kind of batteries.
Yeah, you might need to change the inverter depending on what inverter. Every solar system has an inverter that changes it from DC power to AC power that goes to the grid. And sometimes those inverters only have a single input for the solar. Sometimes they have inputs for both the solar and the storage. So you might install the storage with its own inverter and just have a second inverter. You might convert to an inverter that has 2 inputs, then you have both the solar and storage going into one.
Great. So then how would you calculate how much battery storage you need?
Yeah, it depends on what you want to back up. If you're concerned about blackouts, I think so it's a wide range. It's hard to answer that question. I think what is common is that the total power output will be about the same as your solar. So if you have a 7 kilowatt solar system, you might get a 7 kilowatt battery, and then it might store 14 kilowatt hours of energy, right? So, there's the amount of energy. It really, kilowatt hours is the unit of energy, right? You have so many kilowatt hours stored. And then the power capacity, if you have a 5 kilowatt system, it basically means you can discharge 5 kilowatt hours per hour. It's really as simple as that. A 5 kilowatt system will discharge 5 kilowatt hours per hour. If you have 20 kilowatt hours stored, it takes 4 hours at full power, or you can discharge at half power for 8 hours, right? It's just the amount of kilowatt hour, the amount of energy you have. So what's typical is 2 to 4 hours of discharge at full power. At 5 kilowatt total power output and 10 to 15 kilowatt hours of storage.
Gotcha. So then a set of questions are also related to, okay, depending on how much battery I have, like what does that power? So can batteries power a central heat pump, an induction cooktop, heating appliances, or is it things like lighting, some outlets, a refrigerator? What are we talking about in terms of what can be powered, especially in an outage?
It can be anything you want. Some people will do only the fridge and a couple of things. If you have electric cooking, you're probably going to want that. Some people are doing the air conditioner and everything. I mean, you certainly can do that with enough batteries. All of these residential batteries are stackable. So you can install 1 unit or 2 units or 5 units. There are residential homes that are getting 5 batteries side by side all on one wall of the house, and they have enough to ride through outages for a long time and power the whole home. That's more expensive, obviously. So it's just cost versus what you want.
So glad you said that, because that was one of the other questions that I've seen repeated in the chat multiple times, is like, how big are these things? Where do people install them? How many can I install? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so it's allowed in the garage or in a utility room in your house in certain circumstances, if the utility room has certain ventilation and all that, or on an outside wall. And sometimes in the basement. We don't really have basements in California. But so inside the garage, outside the garage, and they're designed to work on an outside wall or inside. So I think it's either the garage or an outside wall, typically.
Gotcha. And so then given that,
And just sorry, and just how big are they, Brad? Like, how would you
Yeah, I
describe
mean,
them?
it's like
I'm sideways.
a mini fridge, what's your dorm room fridge and all that. It's my, kind of that dimension, but not as wide out from the house. Yeah, I mean, it hangs on the wall, and there's probably going to be a couple of components. You have the main battery unit that is that big, the one box, and then you have a couple of smaller boxes that are just the charge controller and the inverter that are next to that.
Great. And so another theme that's come up in the Q&A several times is, all right, if I'm installing these in my garage, in my basement, on an outside wall, how safe are these batteries?
Well, the product standards are something that is very strictly controlled. So they all have to be UL listed or listed according to a testing lab similar to UL. And those tests are meticulous. They go through, stress tests to make sure they won't catch fire, or cause other problems. So I think, there are battery fires have happened. More often it's not actually a fire, but it's kind of they call it thermal runaway, where it heats up a lot and it could cause fire on, the surrounding area in the building. But it's extremely rare, for all the fire departments are concerned about this and rightly very cautious, but that's why we have strict product standards, and the actual bad things that happen are extremely rare.
Thank you. Okay, another question that I saw, and I think it's coming in, particularly in response to the weather that we have had in California lately, is will batteries fully charge on cloudy days, like how we experienced gray May and June gloom? What then? What happens then?
Yeah, I mean, your solar is working at half output or something when it's really overcast. It's actually rain is tougher than overcast. Overcast, your solar doesn't do too bad. It's not going to have the same power as a bright sunny day, but it still produces power. If it's rainy, it's going to be producing much less. And so, again, it's just all a sizing concern. You can have, if you have a big roof, have enough solar, you can fully charge that battery every day. Typically, on a good day, you're going to charge your battery every day with your solar. You size it so it can be entirely charged from solar. But you can also install a battery without solar. You can charge from the grid and then just use that power for your own consumption. Or a combination of the two. The rule is if you export to the grid, it must be charged entirely from solar. If you charge from the grid, you have to use it only on site for your own usage.
Gotcha. And so then I think that leads pretty well into another set of questions. We had several folks in the Q&A who have PPAs or have lease systems, and like, what are their options in those scenarios? Can you help folks understand what that means for people who might not be familiar, and what the options are for folks in those situations?
Yeah, so if you have a lease or a power purchase agreement, then it's the system provider that owns the system, maintains the system, and you just pay them for having it there, and you use the power is used for your bill reduction or your backup. Those are set usually. It's typically a 20-year term, so you're paying a monthly bill to the solar company, and you get all the benefits of the solar output without having bought the thing up front. But then those companies they don't want you to add on to that or to alter that system, because it's their system, and they're counting on that 20-year consistency. So you want to go back to the same company. Really, the answer to your question is go back to that same company and say, will you install a battery? And all of them would love to. Anyone who has a solar lease that they offer will come out and install a battery. But typically, and it's the same with the local contractor. You want to go to the same person, and they're going to want to do the work on their system.
Great. Okay, thank you. That came up a lot in the Q&A, so really appreciate that. I think we have time for one more question. I think this is a nice broad one to maybe end on. Folks are curious to know what additional capabilities might be worth paying more for. And of course, worth is dependent on each individual person, but like, what's out there? Extra kilowatt hours, reliability, warranty length? What might some of the options be, or things to look for?
Well, some of the communication stuff, the ability to participate in these virtual power plant kind of opportunities. There's some batteries are better than others at that. And then just, I mean, ease of installation, the size, modularity, maybe you don't want a big battery, you want, you just want to do some bill reduction, and a smaller battery is better. So those are a couple, some of them have like the controls built into them, so that it's sort of one unit where you're powering the critical loads and don't need a sub panel. If you have a sub panel sort of built into the whole storage system, that can be a nice benefit. But really, that's up, it's the installer is going to know what they like to, how they like to configure a system, and there's a battery for that.
Right. Thank you so much, Brad. Really appreciate it. Back to you, Dave, to close this out.
All right. All right. I want to thank Brad, our guest speaker here, for just everything that you do, and for taking the time out of your really, really busy schedule to come here, answer these questions. I want to thank you, everyone who's out there, the audience, for taking the time to just get educated so that you can make good choices for yourself as a consumer. I also want to thank you, the audience, for everything that you've done over the last few years to defend your right to make energy from the sun, and stop the utilities from, basically ruining your investment and ruining the investment of millions of people who want solar and are going to be getting it over the next few years. And so there's a lot of thank yous to go around here, and there's a lot of work to be done. We wanted to pause today and spend some time just giving you information for you as a consumer, but obviously we're going to get right back to work with the core bread and butter work of making sure that you have a voice in the decisions that folks in Sacramento are making around your right to protect your investment and make energy from the sun. We didn't get to everyone's question, I'm sure. Hopefully we touched on the majority of the things that are up. We're going to post a recording of this webinar on our website, solarrights.org, sometime probably tomorrow, and if not by tomorrow, on Friday. We are going to email a link to the recording out when we send out our summer newsletter sometime on Friday as well. And if you just have a question that you're just not hearing getting answered here, you can always email us at info@solarrights.org. And we can't promise that we're going to respond right away, but Kaylee and I mean, we really, really, really want to respond to everything that comes in. And so, feel free to email us twice, or call us. Our number is on the website. If you feel like, geez, guys, I'm not getting an answer here, we care about getting back to you. So with that, one more thank you to our guest speaker and to everyone out there, and good night. Thank you again.
Thanks, folks.
Yep, thank you.